Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Donald Trump met at the G7 summit, which marked the first in-person interaction between Trump and Prime Minister Modi in over a year. The two leaders came face-to-face during the G7 family photo with Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Trump, who was seen interacting with world leaders as they walked onto the stage. Well, as a group photo session came to an end, President Trump walked off the stage with Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi and Italy's Giorgia Meloni. Prime Minister Modi was seen huddled in a conversation with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and others. Also, the ice-breaking moment came when world leaders gathered for the G7 roundtable session. As Prime Minister Modi entered the venue, he had a brief chat with EU Council President Antonio Costa, while President Trump was seen interacting with Giorgia Meloni. As Prime Minister Modi went towards his seat, Trump even shook hands with him and exchanged smiles, and the two leaders had a brief chat. It was their first face-to-face meeting in the last 16 months. Then, sitting beside President Trump, Prime Minister Modi raised concerns over the safety of seafarers in the Hormuz Strait. In a statement, Prime Minister Modi said that those working at sea must be able to perform their duties without fear or threat to their lives. With Trump looking, Prime Minister Modi also quoted Ronald Reagan's famous maxim, "Trust but verify," saying that the world suffers from shortage of trust. Later, as the world leaders gathered for an evening reception, Prime Minister Modi was seen lending a helping hand to President Trump as he made his way to the stage. Trump was also seen holding Prime Minister Modi's hand as the two interacted with world leaders. The warmth between the two leaders could potentially mark an inflection point in the strained bilateral ties. All eyes will now be on that much anticipated bilateral between Trump and Modi, which is scheduled for later today. Well, to discuss more on what's happening as far as the G7 summit is concerned, joining us on the broadcast is WION's Assistant Editor for Foreign Affairs, Siddhant Sibal. He's joining us live from WION. Siddhant, you are joining us live, of course, from that venue where the summit is taking place. Beyond the optics, beyond the photos that have been taking place, talk to us about that much anticipated bilateral between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump and those pressing issues that are going to be centered in these discussions that take place.
Well, for sure, the big focus today is the bilateral meeting between Indian Prime Minister and the US President Donald Trump, which comes after a gap of 16 months. We saw those visuals yesterday. But today's meeting that takes place around 6:15 p.m. Indian Standard Time is the first ever sit-down bilateral between the two countries, and comes at a time when relationship essentially has nosedived. We know that there are several issues. First and foremost is the recent killings of the Indian sailors that has shocked and angered India. The second, of course, is trade conversations. Both sides are within distance of closing the gap, and we know that the officials told us yesterday here in France that focus is to conclude it as soon as possible. The USTR travels to India next week. So, yes, there is a glimmer of hope, but overall, we know that the signals aren't very good. We know that earlier in the day, there was a release by the Pentagon where the name of the US Pacific Command has been changed with the Indo being dropped. That's a big signal when it comes to India, and New Delhi, of course, will be noticing that. But by and large, both sides will be hoping to find convergences. While yesterday the optics looked good in terms of the visuals. Both leaders were sitting together, seated together, and of course the Indian Prime Minister had a brief chat with the US President, also having a conversation with him. One thing was significant, I would say, in many ways, his G7 address. The Indian Prime Minister, sitting alongside the US President, not only raised the issue of safety of the Indian seafarers, but he also quoted Ronald Reagan saying that trust but verify. Now, trust is a small word, but in today's world, it is a much sought commodity, and clearly the Indian side will be hoping that the trust with the American side continues, even though Trump's second term doesn't look very positive, hopeful, because it looks like the gains of last 20 years have essentially been in many ways reversed. Well, yes, fundamentally, there are a lot of structural linkages between the two sides. But yes, overall, the assessment of anyone would be that the relationship hasn't been doing well. Let's see what's in store for next few months. We know that the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has been invited by the US President to travel to US, most likely the G20 summit.
Yes.
In Florida in December. And that, of course, visit will be significant if it happens.
Yes, Siddhant, quickly, before we let you go, if you can quickly tell us about those topics that are essentially going to be featured in the joint communique that's going to be issued by the G7 leaders, the plaguing issues that will not just be discussed, but will also feature in that joint statement.
Yes, there are a lot of things. We saw several statements being issued by the G7 yesterday over many issues dominating the global geopolitics. But remember, this year's G7 has two key issues. One, of course, on expected line is the conflict in Ukraine, given the fact that this is a grouping that is dominated by Western countries. The second, of course, is the crisis in West Asia, the conflict there. And we know that there has been an announcement on US and Iran coming to a peace understanding. The signing will take place on Friday in a place which is not far from here where I am standing. But before I let you go, I'll show you the visuals from the ground. It's just past 8:30 a.m. here in France at the site of the G7 summit. And yes, people are still coming in. It will be a long day. And today is a day when, of course, the focus is on the outreach element of the G7 summit. That means the invited countries will be participating, making their interventions. Yes, Prime Minister made intervention yesterday, but today he will be making two key interventions, especially talking about what the global South has in its mind. India is seen as a major power when it comes to the global South, a voice of the global South.
Yes. Yes, Siddhant, we leave it at that. We will, of course, keep coming back to you through the day for all those live updates from the venue itself. For now, we shift focus to other stories.